For 130 days, Dmitry and Denis faced bombings, drones, and successive attacks by Russians inside Konstantynivka. Their strength was already giving out. As the fighting tightened the siege, a young Russian soldier named Daniel was advancing through the same city, not imagining that his fate would be linked to that of the two Ukrainians. Amid bombings and gunfire, it became increasingly likely that their future in Konstantynivka would be sealed by a choice about how or if the three of them would make it out alive. The rifles fired in the direction of the Russians hiding in Konstantynivka. The soldiers' hands felt the vibration of the weapons as the gunpowder exploded to launch the projectiles. The gunshots weren't enough. Grenades rolled down the stairs into the basements, where the enemies tried to hide from the drones. The fighters of the Loot Brigade had been fighting against Moscow's forces in that region for quite some time. They were assault groups specialized in stopping the advance of the small squads that had entered the city. At the time, the RGD-5 grenade was essential for harassing the hidden opponents. Created during the Cold War, it was still widely used to deliver 110 grams of explosives. Enough for the pressure wave and the shrapnel, amplified in enclosed spaces, to take the lives of the enemies. The Loot Brigade did complicated work. Entering these places, they were always aware of the possibility of suffering, soldiers being surprised by the Russians or attacked by the drones flying over Konstantinivka. Even so, they knew it was necessary to constantly counterattack this infiltration to prevent defenders like Dmytro and Denis from being completely surrounded by Moscow's forces. The two had already been in the city for more than 100 days, holding out in their bunker for months. Meanwhile, the Russians were taking the flanks and advancing. The Russian advance into Ivanopilia in the south, Ilivika in the west, and Pretetian in the east was crucial for the invading forces. After that, it became much easier to bombard the city from 3 points. Part of the artillery systems was moved to those regions. Even though they were at the mercy of enemy drones, now the Russians were at a distance that allowed powerful attacks against defenders like Dmytro and Denis. The two had to live with the impacts of mortars and heavy artillery as Russian troops settled around Konstantinivka. Moscow's soldiers began sneaking into the city. Every time the weather got worse, it was certain that more of them would be moving among the houses, using the cover of fog or snowstorms to avoid drone surveillance. And so they went on, looking for both places to hide and Ukrainian bunkers to raid. Sometimes, lone defenders who survived the attacks were found and surrounded, being forced to surrender. Among the Russians wandering through the city was Dmytro Saikov, a soldier of the 1242nd Motor Rifle Regiment, who wandered through Konstantinivka until his final encounter with Dmytro and Denis. Dmytro was becoming increasingly aware of the risk that he might never leave Konstantinivka. He had already been there for 2 months. Every day, the Russians advanced further, the bombings became more frequent, and the sound of explosions echoed more and more loudly throughout the city. It was the soldiers' background music. Fabi bombs, mortars, and everything else Moscow's forces had to pound the ground and the houses. Occasionally, they felt the ground shake near them. Dmytro would crack a few jokes as they tried to take cover. Denis went out a few times to retrieve the food dropped by drones. That was all they had left to eat, and the drones were also watching them. There was someone else observing them. Someone whose videos, later released, bore a mark with symbols that indicated a disturbing line of thought. Their drones attacked them a few times. Houses exploded around them, but Dmytro and Denis had set up good cover. They survived, Maybe these attacks had also started to alert the Russian groups that were roaming around the area. Their commanders had sent them on several missions in the region. Among them was Danil Sychov. He had no connection with the drone personnel. He only had orders and his frustration at being there, after having messed everything up in his previous quiet job. Now, however, he was under attack by the Ukrainians. The Russian assault groups needed to be lucky to avoid running into FPV drones during their advance. Those who tried to approach in armored vehicles were intercepted most of the time. The vehicles filled with smoke, turning into large fires in the middle of the field. The survivors were inevitably hunted on the front lines. It was very difficult to hide when so many lenses were watching the attacks. Some ran over the tracks left by the armored vehicles on the ground, thinking that this way they would avoid the mines. But the greater danger was above them. Explosive drones flew over their heads. Some of the Russians who were sent managed to cross that barrier of fire and found Dmitry and Denis. One of them was clearly lost when he approached the house where the two had set up the bunker. He was a survivor of those attacks. Not knowing where he was, he shouted the identification of his assault group. 422 guys, 42.
2. Wow.
Não recebeu resposta. Mas, disoriented after the bombings, he tried to enter the house. He didn't bother to clear the room. As soon as his shadow appeared at the door, Denis's AK was raised. The shots went through the man. The Russian fell right in front of them. He was already dead when he hit the ground. They had to drag him inside and put him in a corner to keep the other Russians from noticing him. Meanwhile, Danil Sychov and his companion were walking through the city, trying to find the Ukrainians. According to their commander, the first objective was empty and they should get there without any problems. The two advanced between the houses, hiding whenever they heard a drone. The pair walked, breathing heavily, listening to the explosions and aware of the fate of so many soldiers who had fallen victim to those custom aerial attacks. The bombing drones could drop modified hand grenades, 40mm rounds mortar shells, improvised charges, or devices made specifically for them. The shockwave from the blast wasn't always the worst part. Danil had to try to escape from much more than that. The metal casing of the explosive would break into irregular fragments, capable of piercing tissues, blood vessels, lungs, and other organs. Stones, dirt, parts of vehicles, and nearby objects would also turn into projectiles. More and more, he felt that the Ukrainians were closing in on the pair. They found the bodies of other Russians, but up to that moment he still hadn't seen any enemy. He remembered the conversations and how many of his comrades died without seeing a single Ukrainian in the war. Danil thought about his work in Armenia, when he had the very easy mission of acting as a peacekeeper in the conflict with Azerbaijan. It was true that they hadn't done anything when it was necessary. Thousands of Armenians were expelled from Nagorno-Karabakh. But he also didn't complain about not having risked his life in that war that wasn't even his. That dated back to Soviet times, and he was only 23 years old. The conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan hadn't even started in the century when Danil was born. Damn the day he argued with his superior and was given two options: go to Ukraine or face prosecution. Maybe he should have chosen prosecution. Meanwhile, Danil was talking to Dmytro about the situation they were in. He thought about how hard it was for the Ukrainians given the lack of soldiers. It wasn't just the Russian siege that trapped them there. Recruiting was difficult. Ukraine had an aging population, and its population was much smaller than Russia's for fighting such a deadly war. In the middle of the conversation, they heard the enemy approaching. Denis was inside one of the holes they had dug when he heard the man say he would throw a grenade if they didn't surrender. The Russians still hadn't seen him. As soon as he moved, the Ukrainian's shots went through his chest. He fell lifeless. When Denis got closer, he realized that the threat had been a bluff. The man hadn't even unbuttoned his grenade pouch. Shortly after, they saw another enemy approaching. This time, they had to think fast and shoot before he tried to enter the house. The man fell immediately in front of them. The two breathed a sigh of relief. But the truth was that the corpse of that Russian was not good news. The Russians served as a reference point for the drone pilots. Dmitry and Denis didn't know, but in that region, the 13th Russian Assault Unit was operating. Footage from the devices with that mark recorded the explosions over the houses. Many people in the region used symbols like the black sun and other features that, by themselves, didn't necessarily identify an extremist ideology. But in the Russian battalion, it was different. They didn't hide anything. They used the black sun to clearly declare who they followed. They were connected to the Wagner group, and they were part of the mercenaries who started working with the government under the banner of the Afka Corps. Mainly in the Sahel region, where they became famous for war crimes and massacres, as well as for defending the local authorities. The veterans of the Wagner group formed the base of the 13th Russian Assault Unit, operating in Konstantynivka. The Wagner group was not necessarily a neo-Nazi group, even though its leaders openly were. Wagner was a group of mercenaries with very diverse people, including reports of neo-Nazis. But the 13th Assault Unit was known to have more extreme views. Its leaders chose a variant of the Ronald Dahl rune, the black sun, the colors red, white, and black, and the hammer wasn't there by chance either. They were all symbols connected to neo-Nazi groups. Their Telegram channel had reposts from the Rusik group, another unit linked to Wagner, and with leaders who also displayed Nazi symbols. The channel had posts about white men exterminating hostile forms of life in Africa. It was a collection of facts that, when added together, indicated that the unit had an extreme line of thinking. They sent their drones to destroy every house they could, anywhere Ukrainian soldiers had been seen. Any sign of them was attacked. Even when they saw a Russian soldier fall dead in front of a house, the explosions were direct and intense. The house shook. Dmitry and Denis had never experienced an attack of that magnitude. The detonations destroyed everything around. Drones came in through the windows and exploded near them. The two hid in the holes they had dug, their only salvation in the face of the violence of the bombardment. Dmitry looked frightened as everything collapsed around him. Dirt and debris fell on him. Everything went dark. Dmitry tried to move, but he could barely move his arms. He had to dig down, make space to breathe. As soon as he took a breath, he smelled the rotten stench of flesh. The corpse of a Russian had been buried with him. He called out for Denis, but he didn't hear a response. There was only darkness and the ground shaking with new explosions. The situation wasn't bad just for the two Ukrainians. Danil heard the drones hunting them again. His companion ran ahead, stopping a few times to shoot, but whatever was behind them was flying too high, and it carried more than one munition. One of them fell on the soldier, tearing him apart in front of Danil. The man died immediately. The fragments flew toward the young Russian, who ran from there. His rifle fell to the ground when he stumbled and moved away. Standing still and alone, Danil saw himself more and more. With no options in the middle of that insane war, Danil was alone, and Dmytro also seemed alone in that darkness. He spent hours underground. The smell of the corpse beside him made the situation even more terrifying. He was breathing with difficulty. The air filling his lungs was heavy with the weight of earth and death. It was hard to control the rhythm of his breathing. The more frightened he became, it became harder to draw breath, until he heard Denis digging. He was filled with hope. When his friend dug him out of the ground, he breathed in the fresh air and laughed because he was still alive. Nearby, Danil made a decision to stay alive. He walked to a Ukrainian position to surrender. It was a tense approach, hoping not to be shot before they realized his intentions. Danil entered the Ukrainian position grateful to still be alive. He was searched and forced to hand over everything he was carrying. He was tense at first, but then he was given hot food. The soldiers belonged to the 93rd Mechanized Brigade, the same as Dmytro and Denis. They started calling him a bargaining chip because he would be used to recover a Ukrainian prisoner. He expected to be evacuated quickly, but he soon realized that it would be difficult to get out of there alive. The Russians were attacking everything that moved in or out of Konstantynivka. Moscow's drones were watching the area, hunting the Ukrainians. The targets were blown up, finding little protection, even on roads covered by anti-drone nets. The days went by amid so many bombings. The destruction increased everywhere, inside a Ukrainian position and in an increasingly tense battle. Danil realized he could die with them. He would never return to Volgograd, his homeland. One day, the Ukrainians spotted two Russians trying to collect honey from an abandoned beehive. Only one of them was carrying a rifle. Certainly, the other had lost his weapon while fleeing from a drone attack. The defenders fired while the enemies were still distracted. The armed Russian fell. The other ran away quickly. The unarmed one would have to get a rifle from some corpse in the city. That is, if he didn't end up becoming one of those bodies rotting on the ground. Because the Ukrainian drones were also part of the cacophony of explosions all around them. Danil watched the FPVs flying above them, and he knew they were hunting the Russians. That man would be pursued, hearing the buzzing of the drones all day long, and wondering which one would be his. Death was personalized in Ukraine, with an instrument destined for each victim, and an almost intimate video of their final moments. Dmitry and Denis saw when the Russian died in the apiary, and the other one fled in front of the neighboring position. They found it strange that the enemies only had rifles, and they kept thinking about the fate of the one who escaped. The best thing would be to surrender, like other soldiers did almost a month earlier. Yes, it had been about a month since Danil had been with the Ukrainians in the neighboring position. According to them, the man helped to dig and maintain the place. The drones flew over the defenders and the prisoner. Both positions suffered from new drones exploding above them. The number of attacks increased every day. It seemed like it would be the end. There were so many detonations that their ears could no longer register all that intensity. Little by little, they were losing their hearing, but at least they were still alive. In one of the attacks, Danil had to make one of the most important decisions of his life. The Russians were too close. Denis used the AK-12 he had picked up earlier, since the rest of his weapons were trapped in the collapse. The Ukrainians fired at the enemies, trying to hold back the advance until one of them ran out of ammunition. Danil knew that as soon as the Russians entered the position, they would probably kill him, since it was not common to take prisoners in that situation. Besides, he had been with the Ukrainians for so long that he could be considered a traitor. The Russians hated those who surrendered. He carried extra rifles and handed them to the soldiers who were out of ammunition. The fighting continued until they managed to drive the attackers away. It was the end of December 2025. Snow was falling when the weather got even worse. The command of the 93rd Brigade issued the order. It was time to leave under the cover of fog. It was nerve-wracking to run to the ATV that came to pick them up after 4 months in combat. His heart was pounding, anticipating a drone attack. The city echoed with explosions all around. Russian bombs were searching for the Ukrainians. The vehicles sped up through the destruction. Sometimes they heard the buzzing of the drones. That made them huddle in the trailer. The three of them looked up at the sky, expecting the worst to fall upon them, especially now that they were so close to escaping with their lives. It seemed like the explosions were getting closer and closer, until the number of houses started to decrease and the drones disappeared. Finally, the quad bike slowed down and turned back. When the three got off, it felt unreal that it was finally over. Danil spent 2 months with the Ukrainians. Dmitry and Denis remained in that position for 130 continuous days. Now, they had come out of hell. The first phone calls to their families brought out even stronger emotions than the days buried, the first battles or the drone attacks. The war showed the worst of humanity, and leaving it behind made their hearts warm with everything that was best outside of it.